What's happening, everyone? My name is Tim, and on this channel I learned some more about our neighbors to the north in Canada. Now, I realize I don't really know as much about Canada as I think I should know. That's why I made this channel. That's why I'm reacting to these different videos. So if you want to see more of these, please consider subscribing and feel free to recommend videos as well. That really does help. And today I'm watching Canada and the United States' bizarre border. I do feel like so much is made out of our border to the south. I think everyone has heard something about that. And it's so easy to forget that it's just to the north. We almost take for granted the fact that we share the largest land border with Canada. Now I know that that also includes Alaska and Canada, so it's not that single border, but yeah, I mean, I don't know as much as I should know about the borders, so I'm just going to watch this video. Please share your thoughts. If you do enjoy the reaction, please consider liking the video. It really does help, and it just helps it get out to more people. If you like it, maybe others will as well. Now, let's begin.
Canada and the United States share the longest, straightest, possibly boringest border in the world, but look closer and there's plenty of bizarreness to be found.
Okay, that is pretty funny. I mean, I don't understand some of these choices for like why is it particularly there or not, but let's continue.
While these sister nations get along fairly well, they both want to make it really clear whose side of the continent is whose, and they've done this by carving a 20-foot wide space along the border.
And they mentioned like America and Canada gets on pretty well. I know that there are a few differences every so often, but I think that that statement is really true. I mean, I think that it's lucky. It's just the two nations have coexisted so well for most of history, just kind of leaving each other to their own and engaging in trade and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's been a rather nice, it's something we take for granted, I find, because so many places around the world have very tense conflicts with the countries right there.
All 5,500 miles of it. With the exception of the rare New England town that predates national borders or the odd airport that needed expanding, this space is the no-touching zone between the countries, and they're super serious about keeping it clear. It matters not if the no-touching zone runs through hundreds of miles of virtually uninhabited Alaskan Yukon wilderness, those border trees will not stand. Which might make you think this must be the longest, straightest deforested place in the world, but it isn't. Deforested, yes, but straight, not at all. Sure, it looks straight on a map, and the treaties establishing the lines say it's straight, but in the real world, the official border is 900 lines that zigzag from the horizontal by as much as several hundred feet.
I do suppose that does make a lot of sense. It's just easier to picture it as a straight line on a map. But yeah, and even they showed that picture from earlier, I imagine it just gets really wacky, just with like even weird zigzags and stuff.
How did this happen? Well, imagine you're back in North America in the 1800s. The 49th parallel, one of those horizontal lines you see on the globe, has just been set as the national boundary, and it's your job to make it real. You are handed a compass and a ball of string and told to carefully mark off the next 2/3 of a continent. Don't mind that uncharted wilderness in your way, just keep the line straight. Yeah, good luck with that. The men who surveyed the land did the best they could and built over 900 monuments. They're in about as straight a line as you could expect a pre-GPS civilization to make, but it's not the kind of spherical planar intersection that would bring a mathematician joy.
They said 900 monuments. I've never even seen one, at least not one that I know of in person. So I'm curious how many of them are still around. I imagine the vast majority, but some of them might have been destroyed with time.
Nonetheless, these monuments define the border, and the no-touching zone plays connect the dots with them. Oh, and while there are about 900 markers along this section of the border, there are about 8,000 in total that define the shape of the nations. Despite this massive project, Canada and the United States still have disputed territory. There's a series of islands in the Atlantic that the United States claims are part of Maine, and Canada claims are part of New Brunswick. Canada, assuming the islands are hers, built a lighthouse on one of them, and the United States, assuming the islands are hers, pretends the lighthouse doesn't exist. It's not a huge problem, as the argument is mostly over tourists who want to see puffins and fishermen who want to catch lobsters, but let's hope the disagreement gets resolved before someone finds oil under that lighthouse. Even the non-disputed...
Yeah, I mean, if a lot of money got involved, you would definitely get a stronger dispute very fast, and I imagine that's what happens all the time. Like once money gets involved, things that were very peaceful, maybe not so much anymore. But yeah, it's just, I think that that's also something that's so interesting is exactly when you look at the two countries, Canada and the United States, they are kind of shaped a little weirdly, like along the border here. And you see a big part of Canada obviously comes down into like even below a lot of what is America, especially the northern parts of America there. So it's always interesting just to see that you have parts of Canada which are further south than parts of America.
Territory has a few notably weird spots, such as this tick of the border upward into Canada. Zoom in and it gets stranger as the border isn't over solid land but runs through a lake to cut off a bit of Canada before diving back down to the US. This spot is home to about 100 Americans and is a perfect example of how border irregularities are born. Back in 1783, when the victorious Americans were negotiating with the British, who controlled what would one day be Canada, they needed a map, and this map was the best available at the time. While the East Coast looks pretty good, the wester it goes, the sparser it gets. Under negotiation was the edge of what would one day be Minnesota and Manitoba, but unfortunately that area was hidden underneath an inset on the map, so the Americans and the British were bordering blind. Seriously. They guessed the border should start from the northwestern part of this lake and go in a horizontal line until it crossed the Mississippi, somewhere. But somewhere turned out to be nowhere, as the mighty Mississippi stopped short of that line, which left the border vague until 35 years later when a
Okay, yes, so they basically, like, they extrapolated there. That's basically a big no-no. But it's kind of an interesting story. I didn't hear about that one in particular. But even they showed a few images and stuff like that. That's something I've kind of wanted to do, is see some of the historic towns. Maybe one day I'll have to take a trip to some of these border regions and see some of these towns and different things like that. I don't see some of the old towns even here. It's just something I've never taken advantage of.
Second round of negotiations established the aforementioned 49th parallel. But there was still a problem, as the lake mentioned earlier was both higher and less circular than first thought, putting its northwesterly point here, so the existing border had to jump up to meet it and then drop straight down to the 49th, awkwardly cutting off a bit of Canada before heading west to the remainder of the continent. And it turns out you can't just draw a straight-ish line for hundreds of miles without causing a few more problems. One of which was luckily spotted in advance, Vancouver Island, which the 49th would have sliced through, but both sides agreed that would be dumb, so the border swoops around the island. However, next door to Vancouver...
I mean, that just, it makes sense. I don't know if it was as simple as that. There was probably a lot of disagreements over who would get Vancouver Island, but I would assume, I don't know the history too well, or really at all, but I would assume the Canadians had a pretty firm, or the colonies up there at least had a pretty firm base, and just they'd been established for some time, so it doesn't make sense to like include that in America.
Vancouver Island is Point Roberts, which went unnoticed, and thus today the border blithely cuts across. It's a nice little town home to over 1,000 Americans, but has only a primary school, so its older kids have to cross international borders 4 times a day to go to school in their own state. In a pleasing symmetry, the East Coast has the exact opposite situation, with a Canadian island whose only land route is a bridge from the United States. And these two aren't the only places where each country contains a bit of the other. There are several more, easily spotted in satellite photos by the no-touching zone. Regardless of if the land in question is just an uninhabited strip in the middle of a lake in the middle of nowhere, the border between these sister nations must remain clearly marked.
I do think that when you have people living that close to a border, like I imagine you would have a lot of towns and people where maybe you're living in America, but you're so close to a Canadian border that you almost resonate more with the Canadians living just there in Canada than you do with like the vast majority of Americans, because I mean when you're dealing with just so much land and so many different like practices and stuff like that, it's easy to think that somebody who's technically living in America and they're really far to the north might, or really close to the Canadian border, might actually be closer with Canadians than like somebody living down than an American living down in like Texas or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it is certainly interesting. Just it's such a big border, so I'm surprised that there isn't more disputes to this day over like, oh, we want this part or this part. It's just kind of, I don't hear about any of the disputes. I imagine some happen, but I at least don't really hear about them to this day. Okay. Well, that was an interesting video. I mean, it's just nice to be reminded about some of these, some of the things along the Canadian and the United States border, which is a border, like I mentioned, I feel like we take for granted a lot. At least in America we do. It's just one border seems to get all the attention, and the other border, it's like, you know, as far as I hear, very little to no issues ever really take place. I mean, I imagine there are a few, but not really talked, or I don't hear about them at least. But yeah, even some of the sightseeing just along the border was very nice. I mean, I'm sure you got plenty of beautiful towns and attractions along the border, which I definitely have to go and take a look at. Now, I have been to Canada just a few times, to Montreal. I've only ever been to Quebec, the province of Quebec, and really it's just Montreal and some of the outer or greater Montreal area. But aside from that, I haven't really explored Canada at all. So a lot of exploring to do, some beautiful landmarks and sites for sure. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying to learn a little bit more, and I thought that this was just a nice video on the border. Probably have to do a few follow-ups, but let me know if you have any video suggestions, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.